She asked me to move out of the frame. That's how she said it. Not could you step aside for a second or let me get one of just your sister. She said, sweetheart, you're blocking the light. Could you just move out of the frame? I was 22 years old, standing in front of our family home in Oakville, holding a grocery bag because I'd just come back from the store. My sister was in the center of the driveway in a brand new dress, and my mom was crouched down with her phone, trying to get the perfect angle of my sister next to the car. The car my parents had bought her for her 21st birthday, a white Range Rover. The one my dad had spent 3 Saturdays test driving with her. I moved out of the frame. I went inside, put the groceries on the counter, and stood at the kitchen window watching them. My sister tossed her hair. My mom laughed. My dad came out with a coffee and said something that made them both look up at him, like he'd just said the funniest thing in the world. I watched all 3 of them for a few minutes, then I went upstairs to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and opened my laptop. I had a job interview in 2 days. Not the kind my parents talked about at dinner. The kind I'd been applying for in silence, for months, sending out resumes from my room after everyone had gone to sleep. I didn't tell anyone. I'd learned a long time ago that my news didn't land the same way in our house. Growing up, my sister was what my relatives called a natural. She was funny in the way that made adults stop their conversations to listen. She was pretty in a way that people mentioned out loud, to her face, in front of me. She played competitive soccer until she was 16, then switched to ballet, then to photography, and each time she quit something, my parents reframed it as her evolving. She wasn't flaky, she was discovering herself. She wasn't irresponsible, she was creative. I was 2 years older. I was quiet. I did well in school, but not in the way that got talked about. Because doing well in school was just supposed to happen. I worked part-time at a pharmacy starting at 16, and put every paycheck into a savings account, because some part of me, even then, understood that no one was going to hand me a Range Rover. When I got into university, a good one, on a partial scholarship, my mom said, "That's wonderful, honey," and went back to helping my sister rehearse for a school play. When my sister got into the same university 2 years later, my parents threw a dinner party. I don't say this to be bitter. I'm just telling you what it was. You absorb these things over years, and at some point they stop feeling like individual slights and start feeling like weather. Just the climate of the house you grew up in. I moved to Toronto at 23. I'd gotten a job at a mid-size property management firm, entry-level, mostly administrative, but it was a foothold. I found a 1-bedroom in Leslieville, split costs with a roommate for the first year, and started learning everything I could about how buildings worked. Not in an abstract way. In a very specific, boring, detail-oriented way. How leases were structured, how maintenance contracts were negotiated, how operating costs were calculated per square foot, how a building that looked like it was struggling could actually be cash flowing well if you knew where to look. My boss at the time, a woman in her 50s who had built her own portfolio from nothing starting in her late 30s, told me in my first month, "Most people in this industry are waiting for someone to explain it to them. The ones who do well go and figure it out themselves." I figured it out myself. I worked there for 4 years. I got promoted twice. I started managing relationships with some of the firm's smaller commercial clients, and somewhere in there I began quietly saving for something I hadn't told anyone about yet. My family knew I worked in property management. My mom asked me once what that meant exactly. And when I started explaining, she said, "Oh, like being a building superintendent?" And I said yes, kind of, and she nodded and changed the subject. My sister, by that point, had changed her major 3 times and was finishing a communications degree. My parents were still paying her rent in a condo near campus. Every few months my dad would mention that he and my mom were thinking about helping her get into the market when she graduated, maybe put up the down payment on something small, help her get established. I'd never been offered anything like that, but I'd also never asked. The first property I bought on my own was a 4-unit building in Hamilton. Nothing glamorous. One of the units needed a full kitchen renovation. The roof had about 3 years left on it. But the numbers made sense, and the seller was motivated, and I knew the neighborhood was starting to turn. I put in an offer on a Tuesday, had it accepted by Thursday, and didn't tell my family until the sale had already closed. My mom's response was, "Oh, that sounds like a lot of responsibility." My sister's response was, "Wait, you own it? Like the whole building?" My dad asked if I'd talked to a financial advisor. I had, actually. I'd been working with one for 2 years by that point, but I appreciated the concern. I kept that building for 18 months, renovated the problematic unit, found solid long-term tenants, and refinanced. The equity I pulled out went into the next deal, then the next one. I was not moving fast. I was moving deliberately, carefully, the way you do when you know there's no safety net below you. By the time I was 29, I had a stake in 3 properties, 2 in Hamilton, 1 just outside Guelph. Nothing flashy, nothing I posted about online. I still drove the same used Civic I'd bought at 24. I still wore the same winter coat I'd had for 5 years. My family thought I was doing fine, meaning they thought I was comfortable. Meaning they thought I was the stable but unremarkable one. The one who would always be fine, the one who didn't need anything. They were right that I didn't need anything. They were wrong about why. My sister got married the September I turned 31. Her fiancé was nice enough. A guy named something forgettable from a family in Mississauga who had money and weren't shy about it. The engagement party alone was at a venue in the distillery district that I knew, from the work I did, cost somewhere around $4,000 to rent for an evening. My parents paid for the venue. They'd told me 6 months earlier that they were restructuring some things financially. A phrase that I'd come to understand meant they had depleted most of what they'd accumulated and were doing a quiet version of panicking. They didn't say that directly. They said it in the way parents say things when they don't want to be fully accountable for the implications. We're just being careful right now. Things are a bit tight, you understand. I understood. 3 weeks later, my dad called me. He said he and my mom had been thinking, and they were wondering if I might be able to help out with some of the wedding costs. Not much. Just the catering deposit, which they needed to secure by the end of the month. $2,200. They'd pay me back. I transferred the money without asking questions, because that's what you do when you've spent 30 years trying to prove you're the reasonable one. They didn't pay me back. I didn't bring it up. The wedding happened, and it was beautiful, and during the reception my aunt pulled me aside and said, "You must be so proud of your sister," and I smiled and said yes, and she patted my arm like I was 12 years old. My sister's dress cost more than my first car. I found that out not because anyone told me, but because she posted about it on Instagram. $7,000 custom. From a boutique in Yorkville. My mom had taken her to the fitting appointments. There were photos of the two of them, arms around each other, glowing. I wasn't invited to the fittings. No one mentioned them to me. I'm not sure it occurred to anyone that I might have wanted to be there. I flew home for the wedding, spent 3 days in my childhood bedroom, gave a toast that made my sister cry and my relatives clap, and drove myself to the airport at 5 in the morning on the Monday. Because I had meetings that week I hadn't rescheduled. On the plane home I opened a spreadsheet I'd been working on for about 8 months. A property in downtown Hamilton. A mixed-use building. Commercial on the ground floor, 6 residential units above. The owner was older, not interested in the headache of managing it anymore, and had been sitting on an asking price that I thought had some room. I'd been patient. I'd been watching the vacancy rates in that corridor, watching what was happening with the retail on the block, running numbers. I put in an offer from the gate at Pearson. It was accepted before I landed. My dad called me in March, 18 months after the wedding. He said it in the way he always said hard things, which was by not quite saying them at first. A lot of, "You know how things have been, and, with the way the market's moved, and, your mother and I have been talking." What he eventually got to was this: they were behind on the line of credit they'd taken out before the wedding. They'd used it partly for the catering and the flowers and some other things that just added up. The monthly payments were getting uncomfortable. Could I help? I asked how much. He told me. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a coffee going cold next to my laptop. Outside it was one of those flat gray February mornings that Toronto does so well. The kind that makes everything feel like a waiting room. I said, "I'll need a couple of days to look at my own situation." He said, of course, take your time, we're not in crisis or anything." They were a little bit in crisis. I spent those 2 days not deciding whether to help them, but figuring out the terms. Because I had spent a decade watching what happened when money moved through my family without structure. It disappeared. And then someone called me. And then it disappeared again. I wasn't going to keep doing that. I called my dad back and I said I could help, but I wanted to do it properly. I wanted a simple written agreement. I wasn't charging interest. I just wanted the repayment schedule in writing, with a timeline. I said I had a lawyer I'd been working with, and it would take her about an hour to draft something clean. My dad was quiet for a moment, then he said, "We didn't think it would have to be that formal." I said, "I know, but I'd like it to be." There was a pause. He said he'd talk to my mom. He called back the next day and said, "Okay, yes, fine." They'd sign whatever I needed. I wired the money. My lawyer drew up the agreement. My parents signed it, and we all pretended for a while that nothing had changed. The Hamilton building I'd bought the night of my sister's wedding had, by the time I was 32, become something I was genuinely proud of. The commercial unit on the ground floor, which had been vacant when I bought the place, I'd leased to a physiotherapy clinic on a 5-year term. The residential units were fully tenanted. I'd done a modest renovation on 2 of them, replaced the mechanicals, dealt with some drainage issues that the previous owner had been ignoring. The building was, in industry terms, stabilized. I'd also quietly bought into a second commercial property the previous year. A small office building in Guelph I'd acquired with a partner, a woman I'd met through a conference in 2021, who knew the Guelph market better than anyone I'd worked with. We split the equity 50-50. We worked well together. We didn't talk about it publicly. I was by that point managing a portfolio that I won't describe in exact numbers because that's not really the point. The point is that it was significant. Significantly more than anyone in my family understood me to have. I was not wealthy in the way that looks wealthy. I didn't live in a neighborhood that announced anything. I didn't own things designed to be noticed. But I had built something, carefully, over a decade, from nothing. And I had done it without anyone holding the door. My mom called me in April to tell me about a family event I had not heard about until that phone call. My grandmother, my mom's mother, who I adored, who had always been the person in the family who actually asked how I was and waited for the real answer, was turning 80. My aunt, my mom's sister, was organizing a dinner, A proper one, at a restaurant in Burlington that she'd reserved a private room at for the occasion. I said I'd be there. I booked a hotel room nearby because I wasn't interested in staying at my parents' house. What my mom mentioned, toward the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, was that my sister and her husband were thinking of announcing something at the dinner. She didn't say what, but her voice had that particular warmth in it that I recognized. I said that was exciting. She said yes, it was. I asked how things were going otherwise. She said fine. Things were fine, they were managing. She did not ask how things were going for me. The restaurant was one of those places that gets everything right in a quiet way. Good light, good service, not trying too hard. My grandmother was already there when I arrived, sitting at the head of the table in a green dress. And when she saw me, she stood up and held both my hands and looked at me like she always had, like I was the only person in the room. You look well, she said. You look like yourself. I didn't know exactly what she meant by that, but it felt like the most generous thing anyone had said to me in months. I sat down across from my parents. My sister arrived 20 minutes later with her husband, both of them glowing the way people do when they're carrying good news. Within about 10 minutes of sitting down, she'd told the table she was pregnant. My mom burst into tears. My dad stood up to hug them both. My aunt took about 15 photos. My grandmother smiled her careful, observant smile. I hugged my sister. I said I was happy for her. I meant it. At some point during the appetizers, my sister's husband was talking to my dad about real estate, specifically about the Burlington market, whether it was a good time to upsize, whether they should be looking at something with a yard. He worked in finance and had opinions. He turned to me at some point, because apparently it had come up that I worked in property management. And he said, not unkindly, just with that slightly condescending reasonableness of someone who thinks they're in the know, "What do you think? Do you work with residential stuff, or more commercial?" I said I worked mostly with commercial and mixed-use properties. He nodded. So more on the management side, or do you actually own stakes in things? I said I owned a few properties, yes. He tilted his head slightly. In Hamilton, right? My mom mentioned something. I said Hamilton, and Guelph, and one thing closer to the city. He said, oh, cool, in the tone of someone who has recalibrated slightly but doesn't want to show it. I returned to my soup. After the main course, my aunt raised a glass to my grandmother, and then my grandmother raised a glass back and said something short and specific that made everyone go quiet. She had a way of doing that, saying exactly the right thing in exactly the right number of words. She looked around the table and said she was grateful we were all there, and she hoped we'd remember to take care of each other when she was no longer around to make us. She looked at me when she said it. Maybe I imagined that. After dessert, while people were getting coats and my sister was accepting congratulations from the aunt who'd organized the whole thing, my grandmother found her way to my side. She put her hand on my arm and said, quietly, walk me to the car. We went outside. It was cool and clear, that specific kind of Ontario spring night, where you can almost smell the lake, where she stopped before we got to the car, and looked at me with the expression she reserved, for things she'd already thought through carefully. She said, your mother tells me things have been a little difficult for them financially. I said I knew. She said, I hope they're not leaning on you. I said I was okay. She looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, you have always been the one who figured things out for yourself. I want you to know that I've seen that. Even when I couldn't say so directly, I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I could. She patted my arm once. Don't let them take it from you, she said. Whatever you've built. Don't let them take it from you just because you can afford to let them. I said, I won't. She nodded like that settled it. We walked to the car. I kissed her on the cheek and she got in, and I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes after her daughter drove her away, looking up at a sky that was just starting to go dark at the edges. My parents stopped making payments in August. Not dramatically. Not with a phone call. The transfers just stopped coming through, and when I reached out after the second missed one, my dad said they'd had some unexpected costs. Something about the furnace. Something about my sister needing help with the new nursery. And they'd get back on schedule soon. I pulled out the agreement my lawyer had drafted and I read it again, carefully. Then I called my lawyer and I told her what was happening. She reminded me what the terms were. She reminded me that the agreement was enforceable. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said, I want to give them 1 more month. She said that was my choice to make. The 1 month passed. Nothing changed. I called my dad on a Tuesday evening. I was standing at the window of my apartment, looking out at the street. I had made myself a tea I hadn't touched yet. I had thought about this conversation for a long time. Not what I wanted to say, but how I wanted to feel when I said it. Not angry, not sad, just clear. I told him I understood things had been difficult. I told him I'd given them several months of flexibility beyond what we'd agreed. I told him that I was now going to need them to address the outstanding balance, and that if they couldn't do that, I would need to work with my lawyer to discuss the next steps. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list everything they'd done or not done. I just said what was true and what was happening next. My dad said, I didn't think you'd actually do this. I said, I know, he said. This is your family. I said, I know that too. I don't need to walk you through every detail of what happened after that, because the details are less important than the shape of the thing. My parents were, eventually, able to settle the debt. Not all at once, but in a structured way my lawyer negotiated on my behalf. My sister found out what had happened and called me upset, and I listened to her be upset, and then I explained quietly what the actual sequence of events had been. There was a long silence after that. She said, I didn't know they'd borrowed from you. She said, why didn't you tell me? I said I hadn't wanted it to become a thing. She said, it became a thing anyway. I said yes, it had. We were quiet together for a moment, then she said, I'm sorry. I don't think I've paid a lot of attention. That was the most honest thing my sister had ever said to me. I didn't make a production of it. I just said I appreciated her saying so. My grandmother died in November. It wasn't sudden. She'd been getting quieter through the fall, and at some point quiet became very quiet, and then it was over. She was 80 years old and she had lived with intention, and she had left every person who knew her with something specific. What she left me was a letter. Not a legal document, not an estate matter, just a letter, handwritten, that her lawyer passed along after the will had been read. He handed it to me separately, in an envelope with my name on the front in her handwriting. I didn't open it until I got back to my apartment. I sat at my kitchen table with it for a while before I opened it. Then I read it. I'm not going to tell you what it said. Some things are yours. What I'll say is that she had been watching for a long time. She knew things about me that I hadn't known she knew. She named the things I had built, not in dollars, but in the actual substance of them, the choices, the patience, the years of doing it quietly. She said she was proud in a way that didn't feel like something you perform. It felt like something you arrive at, after a very long time of actually paying attention. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then I went to bed and I slept better than I had in a long time. The family event I hadn't been prepared for happened in February, 3 months after my grandmother died. My aunt, the one who had organized the birthday dinner, was marking 25 years in her community organizing work. And some of her colleagues had put together a small celebration at a heritage venue in downtown Hamilton. A nice room. Old brick walls, tall windows, the kind of place that has history in the floors. I had bought that building 14 months earlier. Not because I knew the event was going to be there. I'd bought it because the previous owner had been managing it badly. The bones were excellent, the heritage designation made it interesting from a tax perspective, and the events and meeting room revenue had been underperforming significantly. My property manager had overhauled the booking operation, and by that February it was running at close to full capacity. I found out the event was there because my aunt sent the family a message with the location, and I recognized the address immediately. I considered, for about 48 hours, whether to say anything. I decided not to. Not out of any strategy. Just, I wanted to be there as a family member, to celebrate my aunt for the work she had done. And I didn't need the building to be the story. I sent a gift in advance and I showed up. It was a good evening. My aunt's colleagues talked about her with the specific kind of affection you build over decades of showing up. My aunt cried twice, and recovered both times with dignity. The food was good. The room looked exactly the way I'd hoped it would when I'd first walked through it with my property manager. I was standing near the windows during the cocktail hour when the venue manager, a capable, meticulous woman who had been with that building since before I bought it, came to check in on a logistics issue. She saw me and stopped. Oh, she said professionally. I didn't realize you were attending tonight. I said I was here for my aunt. She smiled and said she'd make sure everything was exactly right. My sister was standing 3 feet away. She had heard the exchange. She looked at me with an expression I didn't entirely know how to read, something between confusion and recalibration. She said, "Do you know her?" I said. "She works for me. I own the building." My sister stared at me for a moment. Then she said, "This building?" I said yes. She looked around the room, at the high ceilings and the original brick and the windows that looked out over downtown Hamilton in the winter dark. She said, "For how long?" I said, "About a year." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does Mom know?" I said I hadn't mentioned it specifically. My sister shook her head very slowly. Not upset. More like someone who is realizing that a story they thought they knew has been going on much longer, and in much greater detail than they understood. She said, "You built all of this yourself?" It wasn't quite a question. I said, "Yeah." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "I didn't know. I really didn't know." I believed her. My mom found out the rest of it gradually, the way information moves through families. Slowly, sideways, until one day it's just there. She called me in March, and she was more careful in that conversation than I'd heard her be in a long time. She asked about my work. She asked about the properties. She asked real questions, the kind that require real answers. I answered them. Toward the end of the call she said, I think your father and we haven't always made you feel like we saw what you were doing." I said, "No, not always." She said, "I'm sorry." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I've been okay for a long time." There was a pause. Then she said, "I think maybe we thought you were fine, and so we didn't look." I said, "You can start looking now." My grandmother had once told me that the people who build things quietly are the ones who are building for themselves, not for an audience. She said it like it was a compliment. I think she meant it as one. I think about that sometimes when I'm walking through one of the buildings, and the maintenance is current, and the tenants are good and everything is running the way it's supposed to run. All of it built without anyone watching. All of it built because I went to work, and I did the reading, and I made the calls, and I put the numbers on the page, and I made decisions that I could live with. Nobody handed me a Range Rover, but I learned how to own the building it's parked in.